Overall, we'll address some key terms just to help frame the conversation, and then addressing questions like why should I strength train, when, and then we'll give some examples of exercises we recommend, at least as a foundation to start for runners. Training, by definition, starting as broad as possible, a sequence of activities done to increase performance. So obviously, training can look like any number of things, but I want to focus most on the terms related to distance running, which can be defined by endurance, strength, and speed training. The challenging thing about these terms is that, as I try to visually show here, they're so interconnected and influencing each other, you really can't dissociate one from the other without losing something significant in your performance. There are definitely different levels of emphasis that people can have based on their experience level. For example, usually we hear focusing on that endurance side for beginners is one of the biggest. But even as I'll define, endurance by itself doesn't really exist. It's always being influenced by strength and speed in your physiological development. And the things we won't even fully address here that also influence that beyond just training are going to be your height, your limb dimensions, how long are your legs, body composition, like basically lean body mass ratios. All those things are going to influence these three major facets. So somebody at the same body weight and even the same height may have different dynamics because of different leg lengths and then their own biological composition. So while there are a lot of good guides with like apps and stuff that address broad metrics from heart rate to leg length or like stride length, that's a very small aspect that it gets a little slippery once you focus too much on those alone. So we want to really present a holistic framework while then ultimately focusing on strength. Because there's other things, nutrition feeds into all this, general biomechanics, meaning how does your running form? How are the angles, range of motions, part of that? We've talked about some of these pieces in other workshops. So you're not thinking of this strength training in isolation. So getting a little more specific, there are two forms of training endurance, aerobic, anaerobic. One, basically how you cope with fatigue when you have oxygen, plentiful oxygen in the muscles, in the body. Anaerobic without oxygen. Now, distance runners are usually more focused on aerobic. That's our foundation. Some of that is associated with this idea of running economy, and Eric's going to delve into that a bit more. But basically, aerobic endurance is developed through a form of strength training. Fundamentally, running itself is an aerobic endurance form of training. But the idea is it's building up our blood system and how our mitochondria, which is what's transporting energy and oxygen, it's sharpening and improving those systems in our body and a lot of other things. Anaerobic, more people think of that with regards to sprinters. And I'm going to define speed in a moment because that's slightly different when we talk about sprinting speed, which is more about velocity. How fast are you moving over time, which is obviously still relevant to distance runners because we talk about general speed in relation to how fast can you finish a distance. But generally, I would say once you get into the half marathon plus range, most people are not getting into any anaerobic system. People that are running shorter than that, 10Ks even, 5Ks and less, you can be working into anaerobic. Granted, even people in half marathons could be getting an anaerobic because it's depending on your conditioning, where your body is at, a lot of factors. So they're both important to think about. They're not exclusive. And there's a lot more that can be talked about, but they have more to do with metabolism, how the blood's flowing, how energy is being transported, and oxygen. So just wanted to frame that. Endurance fundamentally is the ability to resist fatigue, whatever level of intensity you're doing. So one of the key terms, strength, is more about basically how much force can you exert against resistance. Another way of thinking of it is tension generation or like kinetic potential. But strength itself is going to be influenced by muscle composition, the muscle fibers themselves, which can be adapted and changed through training, the neurology, basically how the brain recruits muscles, and then the mechanics. Those three things, muscular, neural, mechanical, are influencing our strength essentially. So a quantifiable example is how much can you lift? But I would say a simpler way, even for distance runs, to think about strength. When we're running, we are moving a body mass ourselves against gravity and friction. So at a base level as a runner, our strength is built up by just learning and strengthening the body to move our body mass through air across ground. Strength, however, will be improved through more high resistance, low reps. And in that, physiology of the muscle can be adjusted and changed and expanded in its power potential. As a note, we won't delve into nutrition much. We've had a whole workshop on that, but protein consumption is really important with strength development. You can fatigue the muscles and the systems to an extent, but if you're not replenishing them with protein needed, they are not going to repair and rebuild in the way they need to be stronger. Finally, to distinguish it from velocity a little bit, speed is basically how quick can you move successfully. And a sort of synonym or sub-branch of speed is power. And again, it's really hard to distinguish sometimes between strength and power because they're so interlinked in many ways. By some measures, power is the rate at which work is done, defined by how fast the muscles can be recruited. And there's ways to train that too, particularly, I think, things like plyometrics or just even running itself. You can develop power and speed through how you do drills or certain types of workouts. So there's different goals people have with running. But if you want to get to the place of getting faster, endurance will get you there to the finish line, but it needs the speed development, which includes strength and speed in that definition. You need those all working together to be at your maximal performance. So that's where we often see someone who's just plain done basic running, they will get that half marathon done. But sometimes they'll get to a place where they feel stuck, like they're not improving. One of the most obvious examples for that is because they haven't done any real strength training, speed development. Those are the pieces that will get them to the next level. Because we're emphasizing strength, thinking of the force you're able to exert. It can't really be dissociated from endurance or speed because how long you can maintain a certain force is going to be defined by duration, and foot strike or arm rhythm is going to be defined by speed. They're all working together. But for the sake of focus in this workshop, thinking about strength, or some would call it weight, or maybe the most appropriate term is resistance training, which is basically a voluntary form of muscle strengthening that can use weight machines or exercise bands, handheld weights, or even just your own body weight. All those things can be employed to improve performance from a strength perspective. As an overview, the importance of that is thinking specifically what your goals are, what race you're training for even. A half marathon is very different from a marathon in some of its training specificity, which is very different from a 5K or an ultra marathon. So the principle of specificity is just important to keep in mind. What are my goals? Because the training needs to be tailored to that specific outcome you're looking for. So strength training, as Eric will soon unpack further, it can be oriented toward any of those three major aspects. You can do strength training that's helping with endurance. It can help with your speed or quickness of movement. And also, all the while, can be helping sharpen biomechanics, tissue resilience, etc. It's a lot of terms to try to keep in mind. Eric's going to unpack them a little bit more, but wanted to help frame that and start answering the question, why should I strength train? Fundamentally, because it's going to help your performance improve.
So I'm a physical therapist and I see many runners with many injuries. And typically, common impairments we see due to lack of strength training, among other things, maybe lack of recruitment for the muscles appropriately. To know, you don't need a full hour to really dedicate. You can just do a few things. It'll be very beneficial for you. So why should we strength train? Well, I'm going to talk about a couple things, specifically tissue adaptation and running economy. But overall, as a PT bias, it really helps reduce the risk of injury. So when you begin training, say just lifting weights, you get strength gains not by the muscle getting bigger, but by the nervous system recruiting better. So the first 2 weeks, you won't see a lot of change in hypertrophy in the muscle, but you will feel stronger. And it's quite amazing how the nervous system works. After 4 to 6 weeks, you'll get, depending on your program, muscle hypertrophy or bigger muscles. You'll have some more tone definition and strength, but it's not going to impede your performance. In fact, it'll make it even better. So the muscle changes, one is just pretty standard, is increased cross-sectional area of the tissue. So the fibers or the muscle cells, you don't necessarily get more, but you get bigger muscle fibers. What's also happening along with the bigger cross-sectional area is also in the tendon too. Tendons attach muscle to bone. So the most common tendon is the Achilles tendon. With the tendon changes, it's increased stiffness from the proteins. So if you load it more, you get something called type 1 collagen synthesis, and that creates more resilience in that tissue and strength. This is an example of tissue adaptations. That cross-sectional area will get a little bit bigger through strength training. And on the right is kind of the cartoon version of that. You don't get more muscle cells, you get bigger muscle cells or muscle fibers. And that's kind of the look of the hypertrophy. Tendon adaptations is the collagen, those fibers in that tendon, get more resilient. So when you stress the system, the tissues respond by either, if it's too much, it gets injured, but if it's just enough of a stimulus, it creates the protein synthesis to get stronger in the muscle and in the tendon. So you have these adaptations going on all the time. Bone is also a tissue that adapts well to running and strengthening as well. There's something called Wolff's Law, and that's pretty much states like any force applied, there will be a reaction to it. Likewise, if you don't apply much force, it's going to get weaker. When you do strength train, you have to do it in the stimulus where you're not overdoing it, but enough stimulus to create that adaptation that will positively impact your performance and reduce your risk of injury. So for a given speed, say there's two of you, or me and Josh is a much better runner. If we were running at 6 miles per hour, he will be much more efficient in running than I will be. In that, he's probably using less like O2 compared to me because I'm just not as trained as he is. So what that really means is hopefully with the same amount of your competitors, same speed, that you're utilizing less oxygen. And that comes from the muscle stiffness in the tissue. As I talked about earlier, with more collagen, more protein synthesis, more cross-sectional area, you have a certain amount of stiffness in that tissue. So when you have more, we'll call it the collagen, the proteins in the tissues, you have this more elastic energy in that tissue. So when you're stretching a tissue out, it's kind of the stored energy that when you release it, it kind of like a spring comes back. So integrating that, the more stiffness in a way of the muscle or the tendon or the ligament, it has a more of a rebound effect, if you will. It creates more passive support as you run. So when your leg's behind you in the trailing limb, you have the stretch of those ligaments, the tendons and muscles will help kind of spring it right back. Therefore, using less oxygen to perform that movement, essentially improve recoil. After several months, you just should be aware that you might plateau because your tissues are adapting. The nervous system's already aware, and the muscles have been pretty used to this stress placed upon it. Alluding to what I just stated earlier, Wolff's Law, you have to kind of keep pushing it a little bit so it can kind of adapt and change. So if you feel not content with it or you're not making these gains, you might have to rethink the reps, the type of exercise you're doing, the heaviness of the weight. So my passion also is reducing the risk of injury. We see this a lot, and there's many components to pain. I tell a lot of my clients that here's pain, and we'll handle the strength and flexibility side, but you have to know that running form is important. Your training, how you train is very important. Recovery, sleep, and diet are essential. So it's a nice graphic. I'll shout out to Wiley, Professor Wiley in Montana. I just borrowed his slide because I went to a running lecture in 2019 about different muscle forces on different structures. Like the quadricep, when you run, is about 4 to 6 times your body weight. The gastrocnemius or the calf is about 3 times your body weight. So there's a lot of forces impacted on running. It's a control landing. So all these muscles really have to control you from falling, if you will. So that being said, it's important to strengthen surrounding muscles to help support your joints and ligaments and bones and all that. This is very common. I'll pick on this strength deficit. There's more to it than just strength, actually. It could just be habit. It could be poor neural recruitment. But knee valgus, if you see runners running, you might see knee cave in. Now, there are elite runners that the knees cave in and they do just fine because they have tissue adaptations. But for the most part, when your knee caves in, it's called knee valgus. And that could be attributed mostly to lack of hip strength. Again, there's other dynamics like range of motion at the ankle could be an issue for this, But for the most part, we see the hip abductors on the side, the glute max aren't firing well. And the hip controls your knee in space. So if your glutes aren't firing well, or they become fatigued or weak, you might get more stress going inside, and that'll put more stress on the knee joint, on the ankle even. So you have more common issues like runner's knee, patellofemoral issues, Achilles tendonitis. To note, they used to think it's called a VMO. It's a vastus medialis, a muscle on the inside. They used to think that was the issue for knee tracking. And that could be part of it, but as the last 20 years, it's been mostly about the hip being the main issue. So you may hear a doctor saying it's the quad being the issue, the VMO, it's not tracking well. May be true, but for the most part, that's been a lot lower on the reasons why. So I do pick on glute strength, and there are other muscles that I love though too. The calf, the quad, core, all those are super important, but I just want to give you an example of one component that's very important for runners. Along with training the muscles, which is super important, is loading the joints, because you want more resilience in your tissues, not just your muscles, but the joints itself. And that's what I usually see a lot of problems come in. The hip joint, again, the runner's knee, that's 50% of runners' injuries are the patellofemoral joint. So on the very far left is the uninjured load capacity, meaning load capacity is what load can you accept well. So on the it would be the y-axis is load and frequency, or just running volume. You can think about that. So there's an area that's manageable, and if you increase the load or frequency too much, it might become excessive and cause injury. Now, when you're injured or have weakness in the tissue, the manageable area becomes much less. And so, say running a mile or running for 1 hour would have been manageable on the left. In the middle, it's not. Your tissue's resilience, the load capacity is not where it needs to be, so you're much more prone for injury. But what I get excited about is people come in without injury and want to prevent injury. So that's the post-rehab load capacity, meaning you just want that white area to get really big. And so it's very rare to get excessive load because you've trained your tissues to be resilient to the forces placed upon that. When I say tissues to you, again, they all respond differently. The blood supply is much bigger in the muscles, so they adapt much faster. The cartilage, not as much. So it takes a while for the tissue turnover to become more resilient. So just know the expectations, depending on the tissue and the injury that you have, dictates the prognosis of how long you can get back. Sarcopenia is a natural wasting away of muscle mass and strength over time. Especially after 30, we lose 1% of our muscle mass and 3% of our strength every year, if not kept in check. Luckily, we have strength to help offset those losses as best we can. When should I load? So this is a very, I want to say actually probably the most complicated question because there's so many variables with us, human beings. We're so busy. We have kids, we have job obligations, whatever obligations. So trying to fit your training schedule, running, and with strengthening, it could be a daunting task. And usually this falls by the wayside. But as I said earlier, you don't need hours and hours to do this. Set aside some time. Usually I give my clients, the runners, 3 exercises to focus on, and you'll get a lot more out of that. So the question that kind of prompted this webinar is, should I strength train on running days or days off, or how often? Ideal world is you have a true rest or recovery day after you strength train. Now, you don't want to work out back-to-back days for the muscle groups because you actually break down the muscle when you strength train and you get stronger when you rest or recover appropriately. What's tough about when you strength train is you also run too. And a lot of runners maybe run 5-6 days a week. So how do you recover well? Incorporating strength training. And that's a tricky question. So the answer is it's great. And the reason why it's great is there are so many considerations. For example, I ask myself, am I really tired? How's my body responding? As I get older, I feel I can't be as active or the frequency I used to have. How conditioned are you? Are you beginning or are you advanced? If you advance, you can probably take on more load as opposed to a beginner. And even how often do you prefer to run? And based upon those, you can kind of make some kind of program that best suits your specific schedule. So general advice is run prior to strength training. Now, it also depends on your focus. Some people want to get better strengthening. So I would prioritize strengthening in the morning, then run later. If you're doing a tempo run or a sprint workout, you kind of beating up your tissues pretty good. So you might as well just kind of strengthen later and then have the next day be a light run or a recovery day. If you're mostly just running at a light pace, you have a lot more variability on where to place the strength training. Ideal world, 2 to 3 times of strength training, probably the very minimum 2 days. Legs, of course, important, but I don't want you to forget core and upper body strength are all important to move your body along and recover well and perform better. And as always, rest days are essential. I've made a mistake where I don't rest because I think more is better, especially when I was younger. So I had a lot of overtraining issues. I couldn't sleep, I was losing weight. I want to give you an example schedule. And again, it is so variable. But Monday, he does an easy run. Tuesday, track workout, which is more vigorous with strength training in the PM. Thursday, same deal, tempo run with strength training in the PM. Friday's easy run, and Saturday's a long run with core exercises. And Sunday is a day of rest. The top exercises for runners, and again, it's variable, but this is what I usually like to give my runners for loading purposes and strength purposes. Single leg bridge is a common butt exercise. It's basically we're on your back and bring your butt up in the air. There's so many variations with that, but I like getting the glute there. Bulgarian split squats, I love that for loading for the knee joint. It's very protective and it gets the quad working and the glutes. Calf raises are pretty self-explanatory, so I didn't include the image, but just raise on your calf. Usually over a step is wonderful with weight to load the Achilles tendon and get that calf strong. Captain Morgan's, that works the outside part of the hip, and usually have runners do squats with that. It's a fantastic loading exercise, but gets the recruitment of the hip working to hopefully prevent that knee valgus as you load it. And a common one is sidestepping with a band. I usually put my band over the toes to kind of really bias the glutes. That's a fantastic one to get your hip abductors working.
The big emphasis we want to, or the takeaway, Eric and I want to give with this is that it really, you don't even have to have like a gym membership to start strength training. You don't even need that much. I mean, people don't even need to buy weights. You can find creative ways to add weight if you want. Resistance bands are very cheap. There's all sorts of creative ways depending on your parameters. But the idea is starting basic too. And a lot of the drills, even that Eric shows, there can be a progression of those, where you do it with just body weight, and then where you add a resistance band, or then you add weights. The key is healthy progression so that tissue has time to adapt. My sort of baseline often of approaching runners from a coaching perspective, I would definitely encourage calf raises, and calf strength is so foundational to distance running because of that Achilles dynamic and how they interact. Without a strong calf, basically, both speed suffers, injury risk heightens, and often biomechanics also get involved. There's a lot of things that start there. So simple calf raises, they can be adapted in a whole number of ways, adding weight on a stair, doing them single leg, but the foundation being start making sure calves are strong. I have some videos that summarize a pre-run warm-up routine, which it's serving multiple purposes. It's warming up limbs from being stiff, but it's also reinforcing mechanics. And in some of the cases, like with the lunge matrix squats, which are just body weight squats, and single leg balance, it's also strengthening in a fine-tuning way a lot of these things. So again, it can be 5 minutes before you run where you could do some basic strength training. Nothing intense, but it's just activating the sort of neurological system at one. It's getting the blood flow, it's warming it up, it's doing a lot of good things. There are things you can fit in around a run, separate from a run. I do emphasize core strength as well. That's for posture, for good breathing. And it can just simply start with push-ups, crunches. And there are a myriad of different ways of doing push-ups and crunches that isolate different aspects of our core, not just the rectus abdominis, the six-pack, basically. And it's important, actually, even not to overwork that six-pack. It can make people almost start slouching because they're getting so strong or so tense. But making sure you're taking care of the obliques, the side muscles, and the back muscles, everything that's keeping that posture up, airways open, and the biomechanics centered in terms of their gravity. And then also, there are other forms of drills that can help develop power and speed, strength, from Crazy Feet, which is about strengthening ankle dynamics. Glute bridges, we're both big fans of those. Rainbows are also addressing glute strength, single leg squats, and more, all generally reinforcing a number of things together. And there are different even forms of exercises that you maybe have heard the terms eccentric, concentric training, isometric training. All those have a place too. Again, it's all about specificity. So for example, isometric, where you're usually holding a stable position, like with a plank, those can be great forms of development, as well as the common flexion exercises like a bicep curl or whatever. Again, starting simple is the key. Doesn't need to be long. Fitting it in where it makes the most sense for your routine and doing it in a way that both addresses things that support running, if that's your main goal, and or if you have vulnerabilities, and that's where running form analyses can be really helpful to understand, working with Eric and or myself to see where am I vulnerable as I build up mileage because maybe of a imbalance or a weakness that needs to be addressed. So there's the preventative side combined with the performance enhancing side. It is a major adjustment in form. So the calves, all the lower legs, the Achilles particularly need that time to adapt to that demand because they're being pushed like they've never been before. So in some sense, the training error could be as if it's done too much too soon. So it needs to be parceled out. But the other side is looking at the running form. Where is the foot striking? And because you can start, some people's calves might be actually quite strong, but their mechanics are bringing their overstriding or for a number of reasons are reaching and hitting the heel. And so there's other things that can be trained, which I would say is more at a neurological level to just how the angles of the hip to the knee to the ankle is moving forward, being ready to strike. So it is a strength question. It can be a training question, but it's also a biomechanics question sometimes, especially with heel striking. It takes kind of an interaction of all those things to help change that habit. And it takes a lot of work to change a habit. They say, if it takes 10,000 repetitions to master something, you might start out a run doing 2,000 steps accurate and then devolve back into previous habits. So it's going to take a lot of weeks really to start, but it can happen. Absolutely. Those habits can change. It just takes a lot of patience because you also want to be safe and not get hurt doing it. And then there's also ways to rehab and help because it's going to get sore. It's going to be sore because it's being worked in a way like it never has.